Hi, folks. Welcome back. Dennis Feitosa, also known as Def Noodles, and happy Independence Day. Today marks the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and I think it's important to look back into history and reflect on what was happening exactly 250 years ago. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted by the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, severing the 13 colonies, the 13 American colonies, political ties to Great Britain. While Congress had actually voted for independence on July 2nd, July 4th is celebrated as Independence Day because that is the date inscribed on the finalized declaration. The Declaration of Independence was primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson, and it announced the colony separation from King George III. Although Congress approved its wording on July 4th, most delegates did not actually sign the famous parchment now preserved at the National Archives until nearly a month later, on August 2nd, 1776. Now, needless to say, I would argue that since its inception, the Declaration of Independence has been one of, if not the most influential political documents of the last 250 years because it transformed into a system of government what was, at the time, a radically Lockean principle of self-government. The idea that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, and that if a government ceases to be representative of its people, those people possess not only the right, but the moral duty to replace it. This stood in direct opposition to the accepted European order of the day, the monarchical system of absolute power, and the doctrine of divine right, which held that political authority flowed from God directly to the monarch rather than through the consent of the governed. The Declaration inverted that understanding, placing sovereignty ultimately in the hands of the people under God rather than in the hands of a king. What followed over the next several years was a brutal revolutionary war that demanded extraordinary sacrifice. During the conflict, Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation, establishing America's first national government. The founders were so skeptical of centralized power that they intentionally created a government which ultimately proved too weak to govern effectively. It required overwhelming agreement among the states before meaningful action could be taken. And needless to say, the representatives of the founding 13 fiercely independent colonies rarely agreed on everything, or pretty much anything, to be honest. As a result, the federal government often found itself unable to effectively govern the country or respond to crises. Now, following the American victory and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the United States entered a relatively difficult transitional period. The nation had secured its independence, but it had not yet established the stable constitutional system that we recognize today. Instead, the country struggled with enormous Revolutionary War debt, economic instability, disputes among the states, and widespread distrust of centralized authority. That skepticism toward centralized government, and especially taxation, remained deeply embedded in the American character, resulting in numerous smaller uprisings and political conflicts during the nation's earliest years. One of the most significant of these was Shays' Rebellion. Between 1786 and 1787, debt-ridden farmers and Revolutionary War veterans in Massachusetts launched an armed uprising against aggressive state tax collection and widespread property foreclosures. The rebellion exposed one of the greatest weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. The federal government lacked both the financial resources and the legal authority to effectively respond. It could neither raise a standing army nor adequately manage the nation's finances, leaving it largely powerless while individual states attempted to restore order themselves. The crisis deeply alarmed leaders like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, convincing many that while centralized power should always be viewed with caution, the nation nevertheless required a strong federal government capable of preserving liberty while maintaining order. That realization ultimately became one of the principal catalysts for the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Now, the Constitution that emerged from that convention did not abandon the principles of the Revolution. In fact, it refined them. Rather than replacing one form of tyranny with another, the founders sought to construct a government powerful enough to function, yet sufficiently restrained to prevent the concentration of power they had just fought a war to escape. They established the constitutional republic we recognize today, creating three equal branches of government, each designed to check and balance the others. And after the Constitution was ratified in 1788, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States in 1789. Now, think about that for a second, folks. It took 13 years from the Declaration of Independence in 1776 until Washington's inauguration in 1789 for the United States to establish the constitutional system and the executive leadership that we now take for granted. Anyway, the Treaty of Paris granted the United States territory stretching all the way to the Mississippi River, opening the door to rapid westward expansion and inevitably countless new opportunities, conflicts, and challenges. Over the next century and a half, as we all know, America continued to define itself. It expanded across this entire continent, survived civil war, industrialized at an unprecedented pace, and ultimately emerged during the First and Second World War as the world's leading economic, military, and technological power. Needless to say, the nation we have today still rests upon the principles established by our founders. The original Declaration of Independence remains preserved in a climate-controlled chamber at the National Archives, and we continue to operate under the same Constitution, the oldest written national Constitution still in continuous use anywhere in the world. That is an extraordinary achievement in and of itself, and I believe one of the primary reasons it has endured for as long is because both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution begin with an extraordinarily realistic understanding of human nature. They recognize that governments are created by imperfect human beings. They acknowledge both the necessity of government and the dangers of concentrated power. They emphasize not only liberty, but also duty, responsibility, dignity, and moral accountability. To me, the opening of the Declaration of Independence, before it even reaches the long list of grievances against King George III, is among the greatest pieces of political writing in the history of humanity because it lays out an objectively realistic, deeply faithful, profoundly prophetic, and God-centered understanding of collective self-government without ever losing sight of the qualities that make governments legitimate, those being faith, duty, dignity, and respect. Now, all that being said, my favorite passage from the Declaration of Independence is the following. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. To me, that is perhaps the most important passage in the entire Declaration of Independence, outside, of course, the recognition that all men are created equal and that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, obviously, when it comes to those rights, we can argue that America has not always lived up to that promise. One could say that the right to life has been profoundly undermined, with abortion becoming normalized, and in states such as California, effectively state-sponsored. One could argue that the liberty enjoyed by the founders is no longer the liberty we experience today, and that one of the lessons of the American experiment is that as governments age and bureaucracies expand, societies generally become less libertarian, not more. At the same time, I do think the pursuit of happiness remains at the heart of the American experience. Whether Americans are truly happy, however, is an entirely different question. When large portions of our population rely on SSRIs, when our veterans continue taking their own lives at alarming rates because of the trauma they carry, and when loneliness, addiction, and despair are increasingly common among our population, we have to ask ourselves whether we are truly living up to the promise contained in those words. Now, I know this is a darker turn than a typical Independence Day speech, but I think it's important to compare the promises of this nation with where we actually stand today. Only by measuring ourselves against those ideals can we begin to understand what still needs to be corrected. Now, the reason why the passage I read has always resonated with me is because in just a few sentences, it captures human nature, civic duty, and the dangers of collective governance with extraordinary precision. It establishes an analytical framework for determining when a government should be overthrown, and it begins with an important act of humility. It doesn't encourage reckless revolution or emotional outbursts. It doesn't appeal to youthful passion or blind ambition. Quite the opposite. It begins by saying that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. In other words, There is inherent value in stability. There is value in preserving institutions that have stood the test of time. There is value in order itself, but the Declaration immediately adds an equal important observation about human nature, that people are generally more willing to endure suffering than to abolish the institutions to which they have become accustomed. In other words, we are creatures of habit. We become accustomed even to systems that oppress us. We normalize dysfunction. We adapt ourselves to declining circumstances because familiarity often feels safer than uncertainty. Now, I find that observation especially fascinating because it creates an interesting tension with a worldview that would emerge decades later through Marxism. Marxism constantly appeals to the dialectic between oppressor and oppressed. It offers people an analytical framework for understanding feelings of injustice and inequality, and in many cases, it correctly identifies that oppression exists. But more often than not, the framework has been redirected toward ends that ultimately centralize more power into the hands of ambitious political actors who have little genuine concern for the public good. It provides a narrative that appeals to people's feelings of oppression while rarely producing institutions that actually secure greater liberty. Instead, history repeatedly shows those movements consolidating authority into governments that become even more controlling than the ones they replaced. Rather than subjecting government to higher moral principles, they tend to subject the individual to the government itself. And that, to me, is one of the truly radical aspects of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They invert the traditional structure of political power throughout most of human history. Governments existed primarily to command individuals. The individual existed for the benefit of the state. The American founders proposed something almost entirely opposite. Government exists to serve the individual because our rights do not originate from government. They originate from God. The government does not grant those rights. It merely exists to protect them. At least that's what it was intended to do. Obviously, that doesn't eliminate civic responsibility. In order for government to function, citizens still bear obligations such as military service when necessary, jury duty, civic participation, voting, paying constitutionally authorized taxes, and contributing to the preservation of the republic itself. Liberty has never meant the absence of responsibility. It has always required citizens willing to sustain the institutions that protect that liberty. All that being said, the remainder of the Declaration then proceeds to justify the colonies' separation from Great Britain by demonstrating that these were not light and transient causes. When you actually read the long list of grievances against King George III, it becomes obvious that the founders were making the case that a long train of abuses and usurpations had, in fact, taken place. They weren't calling for revolution because of a temporary disagreement or a passing political dispute. They believed a pattern had emerged, a sustained effort to reduce the colonies under what they described as absolute despotism. Reading those grievances today naturally raises a question for every American. Are we ourselves becoming more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable? Have we become so accustomed to our own institutions that we are no longer recognizing when they drift away from the principles upon which they were founded? Because that's ultimately where the Declaration takes us. It says that when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object demonstrates a design to reduce a people under absolute despotism, then it is not merely their right to throw off such government, it is their duty. That distinction matters. The founders elevate resistance from being merely permissible to becoming a moral obligation. I mean, remember, earlier in the Declaration, they established that our rights are God-given. If our rights come from God rather than from government, then government itself remains subordinate to God. Human beings are not ultimately subjects of the state. They are subjects of God. That means preserving a just government is itself a moral responsibility. It is our duty, not simply to oppose tyranny, but to establish institutions worthy of protecting the dignity of every person created in the image of God. That's why the Declaration remains so radical even today. Equality, properly understood, is not the modern political concept of enforced equity. It is the recognition that because every human being bears the image of God, every human being possesses inherent dignity. And if every human being possesses inherent dignity, then every human being deserves a government that recognizes and protects that dignity. That's why this document speaks not only about rights, but also about responsibilities. It reminds us that preserving liberty is not someone else's job, it belongs to each generation. That is what makes the Declaration of Independence one of the most extraordinary political documents ever written, and why 250 years later, it still has so much to teach us. And for all those reasons, I love our Declaration of Independence. I read it often, I listen to it often. One of my favorite recordings is narrated by Max McLean, and it's my favorite because he captures the dramatic way of what was actually happening. When you stop and think about it, this wasn't a gathering of emperors or kings. It was a collection of farmers, merchants, lawyers, journalists, and ordinary men who found themselves united around an extraordinary idea. They drafted one of the greatest political documents in the history of humanity, fought a war to defend it, established a government that ultimately proved inadequate, admitted that it wasn't working, came back together, drafted an entirely new constitution, and then built what would eventually become the most prosperous, technologically advanced, militarily powerful nation the world has ever seen. Think about that for a second, folks. In an age where people can't agree on whether a dress is blue and black or white and gold, a generation of Americans came together, disagreed constantly, compromised where necessary, and nevertheless produced institutions that have endured for nearly 2.5 centuries. If that's not one of the greatest political achievements in human history, I don't know what is. Now, more often than not, we're encouraged to believe that our differences today are irreconcilable, that America is hopelessly divided, that the country is doomed, that decline is inevitable. I'll be honest, I've fallen into that kind of thinking myself. I've been black-pilled. I've had moments where I've looked at everything happening around us and wondered whether we've already passed the point of no return. But every time I come back and read the Declaration of Independence, I find myself regaining hope. I remember how this nation actually began. I remember that these people weren't operating under ideal circumstances. They weren't wealthy. They weren't secure. They weren't guaranteed victory by any stretch of the imagination. They crossed an ocean in wooden ships, settled an unfamiliar continent, endured disease, conflict, famine, harsh winters, and war, and somehow managed to establish prosperous communities, functioning institutions, and eventually a constitutional republic unlike anything the world had ever seen. Just think about it for a second, folks. How much has happened in the last 250 years? We went from a frontier society to landing on the moon. We went from handwritten letters carried on horseback to communicating instantly with anyone on Earth. We went from hauling water by hand to turning on a faucet. We went from candlelight to electricity, from horse-drawn wagons to commercial aviation, from isolated villages to instantaneous global communication with any being whatsoever. Virtually everything we take for granted today has emerged during the lifetime of our republic. As we celebrate this quarter millennium and begin looking toward the next 250, I think it's worth asking ourselves where we are, where we're headed, and whether we're still living up to the promises contained in our founding documents. I do believe those promises still endure. I believe America still remains the greatest experiment in self-government ever attempted. But I also believe we've drifted further from some of those original principles than many people are willing to admit. And one of the clearest examples of that drift is our relationship with government itself. The founders possessed an extraordinary skepticism towards centralized authority, and particularly toward taxation. As I mentioned earlier, the Articles of Confederation created a federal government that was arguably too weak precisely because the founders feared concentrating power in Philadelphia. It was only after events like Shays' Rebellion that many of them concluded a stronger national government was necessary. Even then, their goal was never to create a government that would dominate society. Their goal was to create one that was strong enough to preserve order while remaining limited enough to preserve liberty. In fact, during the Constitutional Convention, there were even discussions about whether America should adopt some form of constitutional monarchy. At one point, some even floated the idea of inviting Prince Henry of Prussia to become an American monarch. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and we instead adopted what I believe is a far better system, a constitutional republic with a rotating executive rather than a hereditary ruler. The two-term limit itself didn't become law until much later, after Franklin Delano Roosevelt broke George Washington's long-standing precedent by serving 4 terms, ultimately leading to the ratification of the 22nd Amendment. And that said, I think that what we've in fact witnessed over the last 250 years is not the abandonment of America's founding principles, but a gradual departure from many of the habits that sustained them. America was founded upon extraordinary principles, but it was built upon extraordinary habits, habits of civic participation, local government, restraint, responsibility, and skepticism toward concentrated power. Over time, many of those habits have weakened. The federal government has expanded dramatically. Bureaucracies have grown enormously. The relationship between citizens and the state has fundamentally changed. The federal income tax, made permanent through the 16th Amendment, fundamentally altered the way Americans finance their government, creating a far more centralized fiscal structure than the founders ever envisioned. Likewise, much of the Hamiltonian economic tradition, which emphasized developing domestic manufacturing and productive capacity, gave way over the course of globalization to outsourcing much of America's industrial base overseas. COVID exposed just how vulnerable that made us, particularly when it came to pharmaceutical production and the critical supply chains that have become heavily dependent on China. That said, America today is, without question, a fundamentally different nation than the one that declared its independence in 1776. We are wealthier, more technologically advanced, and more interconnected than the founders could have ever imagined. But development alone does not necessarily mean progress. The more important question is whether that development continues to serve the principles upon which the nation was founded. Are we becoming more free, more self-governing, more responsible, more virtuous? Or have we simply become more comfortable with larger institutions making more decisions on our behalf? Those are difficult questions, but I think they're questions worth asking. And as we celebrate this 250th anniversary, they're becoming even more relevant. We continue seeing political movements that appeal almost exclusively to grievance, class conflict, and redistribution. Whether it's the growing popularity of open socialist politicians such as Zoran Mamdani or broader ideological movements that increasingly frame society through the lens of oppressor and oppressed, we're witnessing ideas that stand in sharp contrast to the philosophical foundations laid down in the Declaration of Independence. Now, that said, I don't know where America is headed. I'm not going to pretend that I do. Only God knows the future. My responsibility isn't to predict the future. My responsibility is simply to remain watchful, to pay attention, to participate, to fulfill the civic responsibilities entrusted to every citizen of this republic. That's one of the reasons I become concerned when I see declining participation in our institutions. Voter turnout remains disappointingly low. Public confidence in elections has eroded. Civic engagement has weakened. Too many Americans have become spectators instead of participants, yet the entire American experiment depends upon citizens willing to govern themselves. As Pat Buchanan once warned, America faces what he described as the centrifugal force of multiculturalism, a force that, in his view, threatens to pull the country apart from within. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, I think we can all acknowledge that the country feels increasingly fragmented and tribalized. The question is whether we intend to reverse that trend or simply accept it. So on this 250th anniversary, I think every American should ask themselves a simple question. Do we honestly believe America can endure another 250 years if we continue drifting away from the principles that made this country successful in the first place? If the answer is no, then the obvious follow-up question is, what are we going to do about it? How do we ensure that our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren inherit not only the prosperity we've enjoyed, but also the liberty that made that prosperity possible? Now look, as I said earlier, despite everything, I remain hopeful. Reading the Declaration of Independence fills me with hope because I don't simply see a remarkable political document. I see the hand of providence. I see a small group of ordinary men accomplishing something that, by every worldly measure, should have been impossible. I see God working through history. And that gives me confidence because I believe that no matter how dark circumstances may appear, God is always capable of raising up good men and women willing to defend what is good, true, and just. Even when everything appears lost, victory remains possible. Now, that said, there are plenty of people today who delight in predicting America's collapse. Osama bin Laden once referred to Americans as descendants of the Crusaders. Others dismiss the founders as nothing more than Freemasons and argue that America's stated principles were never genuine to begin with. Social media is currently filled with predictions of America's inevitable decline. Now, that said, even in the midst of this doomerism, one of my favorite stories from this current 4th of July perfectly captures what I believe the American spirit actually is. There's a video circulating online showing a skydiver carrying an American flag who gets caught in a tree before crashing face first through a tent. Millions of people are sharing the clip because they think it's embarrassing. They're saying that it perfectly encapsulates America's downfall. Now, what most of these individuals aren't sharing is what reportedly happened afterward. The skydiver got up, dusted himself off, treated a busted lip, and did the jump again. That's America. We get knocked down, we make mistakes, we fail, sometimes spectacularly, but we get back up and we keep going. From the failure of the Articles of Confederation came one of the greatest constitutions ever written. From a collection of 13 struggling colonies, financially bankrupt colonies, came the most prosperous nation in human history. From bankruptcy came abundance. From uncertainty came stability. From weakness came strength. The promise of America has always been one of resilience, hope, liberty, and ultimately subjection to God rather than to earthly rulers. That's why I still believe this is the greatest nation on earth. And look, yes, there are civilizations older than ours. China stretches its history back thousands of years. Egypt stretches back even further. But here's the thing, folks. In just 250 years, the United States accomplished what no other nation has accomplished in such a short span of time. And I believe our greatest days are still ahead of us. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Happy 250th anniversary, America. Happy 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. God bless you. God bless your families. God bless the United States of America. I love this country, and I hope you all have a terrific 4th of July, a wonderful Independence Day. Take care. Peace.